Thank you, everyone. It is so lovely to be here with you this afternoon, and I'm really so grateful that you took time out of your day to come and actually hear what I have to say. And we're going to talk this afternoon about workplace mental health and why it is so important that we start looking at whether or not your organisation should actually be taking on a chief mental health advisor. Now, a lot of you may not realise that we've got a big problem, not just from COVID, but actually generally in mental health. So what's the issue? The issue is that prior to COVID, we had 1 in 5 Australians were actually diagnosed with a mental health condition. Now, post-COVID, we've got 4 in 5 Australians who are actually talking about the fact that they've experienced psychological distress. And over the period of the pandemic, we've actually ended up with a whole bunch of people in the workplace who are identifying that they're struggling, that they're not managing very well, either through anxiety or some other form of low mood, perhaps. But it's become much more noticeable in the workplace that we have to learn to adjust the way that we do things in the workplace, because now all employers are actually responsible for the mental health of their staff. We're seeing new legislation actually coming in Victoria very shortly that's going to put really squarely the responsibility of workplace mental health firmly on the heads of these organisations. And actually Victoria is one of the most, I want to say, prominent states in terms of the regulatory framework that they use to actually make sure that you're complying with your obligations as an employer, and they come and check up on you, and they'll have investigators check in if you've got a staff member that's reported an issue. So when those sorts of new pieces of legislation come through, what we see in the work environment is that we have to step up and come to the table with how we're going to address these challenges. Now, most CEOs say to me, but I don't actually have any mental health or psychological training. A lot of organisations will take their staff members through, you know, mental health first aid or some of those similar kind of training programs, and then think that they've ticked the box as far as it goes with regards to mental health. But I say to people, we have to build mental fitness. We have to build mental fitness in the same way that we build physical fitness. You know, I don't know about you, but if I go to the gym, I'm not expecting to go once and all of a sudden I've got a buff body, right? Doesn't work like that, does it? No. You can't expect to go once and have everything perfected. You have to go and you have to train and you have to remind your body about what it is there to do and actually build that muscle, and it takes time. Mental muscle is the same. We have to actually reinforce the things that we talk about. We have to remind people about how to manage their own mental health and the obligations around that. And then we have to give them ways and strategies that we can support them when they report in the workplace that they've got an issue. Because the challenge of all of this is that when they report, especially in this country, then it becomes the employer's responsibility. What I find interesting is that in the US, it isn't an obligation actually on the staff member to report. If an employer notices that somebody has an issue, a disability in this case in most of those states, then the employer has an obligation to actually make change to ensure that they accommodate the disability. So it's an interesting space in terms of what happens around the law, how the laws change in different places and different countries, obviously, but as we see a lot, even in different states within different countries, and then what that translates to when those people sort of turn up to work, and what our obligations as employers is, and what's the obligation of the staff member. So who am I to talk to you about this? I was once written up as the most influential woman in mental health. Well, you know, I didn't write it, somebody else did. Maybe there's more influential people, but recently I was written up as the maven of mental health. I see myself as a maverick. I often talk about the fact that I approach mental health in a way that's quite different, and probably that's because of my own lived experience. And I think that what makes me a good therapist and a person who really understands what it means to be human and the general ups and downs that we have in our human experience, it's that element of it and normalising our human experience that probably makes me good at what I do. So I want to talk to you a little bit about when we're trying to build mental muscle, like I said before, what happens in the normal work environment when we're trying to talk about knowledge transfer. You might know this number, the 70-20-10 model, is the numbers that are often thrown around about any training program. When you put somebody through a training program, you expect, actually the formal training program is the number 10 up there, that we're talking about the fact that 10% of our training in any kind of knowledge building in the work environment is done through formal training. 20% is done through mentoring, and 70% is done when we're on the job. So there's a basic understanding around what happens when we start talking about general training, if you were doing any knowledge transfer. So if that's the case, 70% of the learning is actually done on the job by doing the job, then how can we expect people to just learn mental health literacy unless it's demonstrated to them day in, day out? We really can't. You can't expect a knowledge transfer to happen if we're not actually demonstrating it in our day-to-day experience. So we have to not only train, but we have to then immerse and repeat and reinforce and set up a whole range of policies and procedures that are then supported and backed up by everything that we do within the organisation, so that people know where they stand, what their obligations are, what they can expect from us as an employer, how we're going to support them, right? But then we've got to rinse and repeat, because it's really important to your workplace culture that people understand what their obligations are and what your obligations is to them as their employer. And your culture is the key to your profitability. So we talk about two areas within mental health around psychosocial injuries. So we've got, just mental health in general, where you've got staff members who might already have identified that they've got a mental health issue, and then how do we manage that within the work environment? So when they've disclosed a mental health concern, we actually have to stop and look at what our HR policies do around that, because there is an obligation on you as an employer to make sure that if they've disclosed it, that you're providing some supports for them if they're then saying they're having a difficult time. Because the thing that we've got to remember about mental health in general is that there are issues that people experience that have nothing to do with the work environment, right? Who here has ever had somebody in their life who became ill? Gone through a relationship breakdown, may have had an accident, car accident or something else, or is looking after a loved one who's had a bit of an issue, an elderly parent who's not well. All of these things are things that happen outside of the work environment, but they're going to impact on how your staff show up every day. So if they've got an outside issue that we're aware of, then we need to be able to have a situation in which they can tell you that they are experiencing some other issue that's outside of work. It's not related to their work directly. You didn't cause the problem, but you do have to accommodate it. You do have to put in place some systems that allow them to go through what is their difficulty in their personal life, because it will impact their working life. Who's heard of that, a whole idea that, you should just leave your personal life at the door? Can't do that. We never really could do that. I think it was a fallacy of the 50s, actually, that says we could really ever leave our personal life at the door. But somehow we were expected to. Now, we see it in some of the different professions like policing or AMBOs or, a defence member. Putting on a uniform makes it easier for them to actually have a separation between their life and work. It's like when we put on that uniform, we put on a different persona. It's easier for us to kind of close down what might be happening at home. But in some ways, that's also a little bit dangerous. We see it also in the resources sector, construction areas where we know that there's big mental health issues, but we just put on our high vis and we go off to work and we pretend everything's fine. And then when we find that people that we're working with have taken their own lives and nobody says anything about it, what do you think that does to the culture of the people who work in that area? We have to stop pretending. Because we don't know how to deal with it, we have to stop pretending it's not a problem. Just because it makes you uncomfortable is not a reason to ignore it. Culture really is about collective mental health, and when we have injuries that happen, how we handle them in the workplace is really a key to how that person will recover. So we've got known sectors like emergency services where we know that people are exposed to traumatic incidents, and we know that the likelihood that they end up with a psychological issue is much greater because they're just exposed to more trauma, right? So we know this, okay? But if they've got personal issues going on at home, their ability to be able to manage the amount of trauma that they're taking in gets reduced. So if you know that their relationship has broken down, their chances of being able to just put on their uniform and a stiff upper lip and get on with it is actually harder than it would normally be. So, I hear stories of people all the time who are doing things really well for 20 odd years, and then one incident that doesn't seem like a big incident, but one incident changes everything, and all of a sudden this person's got chronic PTSD and isn't able to work anymore. And I get a lot of people who say to me, I don't understand what tipped it over the edge. We know in those situations what tips it over the edge is the exposure to things that are not normal. For example, if you're a paramedic and you come on the scene of an accident in which a young person or a child passes away, that's not normal. It goes against our standard human ways of doing things. So of course we're going to react to it. It's a big issue, and we just need to understand that those issues can't be ignored. We can't keep pretending that it doesn't happen. The other thing that impacts psychological injury in the workplace is actually how we approach these things and the judgment that we apply in the first 3 months of a change. So change management is the number one thing in the work environment that is likely to cause a psychosocial injury. And it's because it's poorly managed change. Most change processes, you might even bring in a change consultant, but the change consultant talks about the process of the change in the work environment. The change consultant doesn't actually look at how that change might impact your people. So I often get called into workplaces because they've just been through a change process and they've got a lot of problems starting to manifest. People aren't happy, people are taking leave, they can't actually understand what's going on. I'll often get called in by a new CEO within 3 months of them taking over the role, because what we see in the first 3 months is how people react to the change. And if that leader comes in because they've been appointed by the board with a really strong mandate to actually make it different, to change this place because, they're the ones with the experience. I mean, I get it. You really experienced people. But if you go in and try and stomp your way of doing things over the top of an existing fragile organisation that's just lost its leader for whatever reason, you're going to cause more problems. And this is where we end up often with toxic workplace cultures. When we look at an injured worker, or when we look at somebody who's struggling with mental health with compassion, what we end up seeing is that we can make reasonable adjustments for them. We see this a lot post-pandemic. People talking about, when I was at home, I actually got to spend more time with my animals and that makes me feel better. And so I kind of do want to have a couple of days a week at home. And we've had organisations who turn around and say, we just need everybody back at work. It's time to get back into the office, people. But everybody's different. Should we actually force everybody down the same sausage mincer? Haven't we learnt as a result of the pandemic that that's not necessary anymore? That people can work in this very kind of different way, quite fluid actually. And what did we notice about what happened in the pandemic? Most people are more productive when they're working from home. I'm going to say they were bored, right? So they just got in and did the work because the work was there. It was harder to get off the computer and get away from stuff. Although if you were homeschooling, whoever had to do that, I really feel for people who had to homeschool and work and do everything else, right? But it's not that surprising then that we keep hearing this term, the Great Resignation. It happened in the US in 2021. It's happened less so in Australia until 2022. And what we now see is we've got the largest numbers of change, people changing jobs, than we've seen in more than a decade. In fact, in some states, it's probably more than 20 years. Victoria, not surprisingly, and I know I've talked about you a bit, but Victoria's actually had one of the highest rates of change in terms of people saying they want out, they want a new job, or they've actually already changed jobs. So why is this a problem for you as an employer? It's a problem because the numbers of people available to work for you have become a lot less. I don't know if you noticed that. We had such massive burnout as a result of the pandemic that people have left industries that they'd been in for years. People decided that they wanted to opt for a different lifestyle, a different way of working. But the other thing that happened is that they associated their unhappiness with everything that happened during the pandemic to the employer that they were with at the time. So post-pandemic, everybody just turns around and kind of goes, I just want a new job. I want something that doesn't remind me of that time in my life where I really actually wasn't that happy because I couldn't go anywhere and do things. Now, they were things that applied to all of us as far as our kind of, culture went. We couldn't go where we wanted to. We didn't have the freedom. But we associate that with the things that were around us at the time. So it's no surprise to me that a lot of people have decided that they want to change roles right now. Stressed staff get stressed for a range of reasons, but the inflexibility of management around things that they want to do. So go back to what I said about we just want people back in the office, right? But if you actually stick that to a hard line, you're going to find that those people go and find a job elsewhere because it's actually an employee's market right now. I'm sure you've all noticed that as employers trying to find the right people. It's very difficult to find the right people. We've got a massive skills shortage. Now, I was laughing because I've just written a new book, and the new book comes out in February 2023, and it's called How to Heal a Workplace. Tackle trauma, promote psychological safety, and boost happiness at work. Now, the reason I wrote the book is because of all of the things that I'm talking to you about. The pandemic changed the way that we want to work, and we have to acknowledge how it's changed. For a lot of people, it changed for the better, but for a lot of employers, it started to highlight some of the cracks that were already in the culture of the organisation, and it's kind of broken open these great big chasms of issues that a lot of people don't know how to resolve. So, if we're inflexible in the management of some of these mental health concerns, it actually increases the recovery time of a person's injury. So if they're injured at work and you become inflexible, what happens is they don't come back. They see the doctor gives them a medical certificate, they're off on stress leave, they may be looking for another job, you may never see them again. If you are too inflexible and rigid right now, they're just going to go. You won't be able to keep them around. So it's interesting when we talk about mental health, and in that middle management layer, it's really where we talk about mental health literacy. Now, a lot of you will have done mental health first aid of some sort, but like I said, mental health first aid is not enough. The mental health literacy of your management team literally change what I call the outcomes that happens from the leadership lottery. So what that means is that a person's ability to recover and a person's ability to be able to get on with their life have an awful lot to do with who their leader is and how flexible that leader actually is and how confident that leader is to talk to them about their mental health concerns and how it's affecting their work. And the more compassion we can show through our leadership in that moment, the better the outcome for the staff member and the more likely they are going to be to return to the workplace quicker. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why you need them to come back to work quicker, and you need them to be focused and as productive as they can be, because we also understand the levels of presenteeism. So people turning up where the lights are on but nobody's really home. So inclusion is a really important part of any kind of workplace injury, or I'm going to say any mental health concern. So if you go back to what I said, you've got a staff member who's off because maybe they've contracted cancer, or maybe their partner has, or maybe they've lost a parent or a loved one. You really can't give them 3 days off work to attend the funeral and expect that they're going to just come back to work and get on with it. It's not how we work. It's not how human beings work. And we need to understand and apply some of our humanness to the way that we approach our people. And if we do that, we naturally become more compassionate. It's not hard to apply your humanness in the work context. It's just that we've been told for years that we shouldn't, Doesn't matter. Shouldn't bring that stuff to work. Oh, don't worry about that bloke's, marriage breaking down. He'll be fine. He'll get over it. But we don't. It has such a big impact on the way that we show up in the world. Avoidance. It's such a big issue. Do you know what? We don't talk to people about their mental health because we're really uncomfortable about it, right? We don't know how to deal with the stuff that they're talking about. But you know what? You don't have to be a psychologist. You don't have to know. You just have to have some compassion. Validate what it is that they're telling you. Wow, that must be really hard. You don't actually have to fix the problem for them. It's a tendency of human beings to actually try and fix the problem all the time. We see this everywhere. It's kind of like, you're sitting down with a friend and they're telling you all about, I don't know, their marriage problems or whatever. And you're there trying to, have you tried this? Have you tried that? We're always trying to tell them how to fix it. But sometimes we just need to listen and we just need to acknowledge and we just need to recognise that sometimes we just want to go, wow, that must be really hard. And hear them. We're always so busy, we never hear them. So I want you to think about the things that it makes you uncomfortable, right? Because this is as much about everybody in this room having a look at their own mental health and how things make them uncomfortable, and then that's why we avoid them, and that's why we don't show up with our people in the same way. Maybe we feel, uncomfortable about what we should say or shouldn't say because we don't know how to deal with it. Do you know what happens? If you say to that person, well, I'm really sorry to hear that, I'm not sure what to say, they'll usually turn around and say, oh, that's okay. I just needed somebody to listen. They need to be heard. They don't need you to fix their problems, but they do need you to hear them and make some adjustments for how it's impacting their work. When we acknowledge pain, it doesn't matter how we do it, but we just need to acknowledge it. I always say to people, sorry is not the admission of liability, it's just the acknowledgement of the pain. And in the new book, I talk about the difference in validation, because validation in the English language actually has two distinct meanings. And it's part of the problem, I think, that we have in this workplace mental health context. There's a difference between the judgment that we have about somebody's situation or acknowledging the situation that they're in. So if we can do it without judgment, it goes a lot further. So in the terms of validation, though, we have two distinct meanings. One is the action validation, which is the process of undertaking some sort of assessment, whether that's an investigation or, got to talk to this one or that one. You as a leader, you've got two people who've come to you with a problem, or maybe one person about somebody else, and you might go through, he said, she said. It really doesn't matter. What that person needs is recognition. It's the recognition validation that how they're feeling is having a big impact on them. And when you give them recognition validation, what you find is that they'll get on with things a lot quicker. It may or may not resolve the problem. If you acknowledge the fact that you heard them and you give them some level of validation, it goes a long way. So one of the main things that I end up in organisations doing at the very beginning is looking at their policies and procedures, because most of the problems that turn up in the work context in terms of I've got a psychosocial injury is often because people didn't know what their obligations were. There was no consistency in the policies. There was no consistency in the application or following procedures. And so sometimes just a basic review, and you should really be doing these every 3 to 6 months at most, depending on the size of your organisation, but they have to be consistent. Had a funny discussion with my daughter last night. So she's actually just taken on her, first major full-time role after graduating, and she was telling me this story. She was really scared. She was so scared to bring this up, but there was a big, group meeting, and they were asking how was everything going? And she actually pointed out that she'd been told by half a dozen different people, and this is literally, can I point out, she's a pastry chef, but this was about how you make a sandwich. And it was the actual bits that go inside the sandwich, but the order that it went in. Half a dozen different people had told her off at different points because she had to do it this way or that way, and they were all actually different. And so in this group meeting, she said, "Oh, so scared, Mum," but I kind of said, you know what? We really need to have some clear procedures on how this sandwich, if it's on the menu, gets made. And then if somebody says to me, you're doing it wrong, I can go, but this is how the procedure says it has to be done. Because otherwise she gets stressed because you've got all of these people going, no, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. No, you can't do it that way. And that's actually the biggest problem when we've got a new person coming in. They get so many bits of conflicting advice. So review your policies, make sure they're consistent. It's really important. Escalating issues, making sure that your new starters know who they can go to escalate an issue, and if they escalate it to that person and that person doesn't actually give them a satisfactory outcome or they don't feel heard, who's the next person that they go to? What's the process? What's the procedure that they have to follow? Then we need to give them some mentoring around mental health awareness. If you don't have a lot of awareness in your organisation around mental health, get somebody in to help you understand it. You know, I go into organisations all the time talking about what mental health actually is. You know, it's not the fact that we have young people, right? Because I don't know about you, but the Gen Zs in the world, the Zoomers as we like to call them, you know, they understand their own mental health. They've grown up in a society that has supported them to be able to say, right through their adolescence, by the way, oh no, I can't do that, I'm too anxious. Stop. And they won't go any further. And although I understand it from the psychological perspective, what we have to do is start helping them work their way through it. Okay, so I understand that feels too hard today. What can I do to help you or support you so that tomorrow when you try the same thing, you feel like you can actually achieve it? Because a lot of what happened to those young people when they were growing up is they had two working parents who were very busy, and when they had a problem, usually the parent was kind of like, oh, I'll fix that for you, right? And hey, I can even claim some of this stuff myself, right? I was a full-time single working mother who was studying part-time. You know, sometimes it was just easier to turn up to the school and sort the issue out myself. It was a lot quicker than trying to build the resilience in the child to do it. And it's one of the issues that we've got in our current workplace environments is that these young people, and I'm not trying to sound negative, okay, but it's a reality, they lack resilience. They're so used to that, holding up that mental health card, that they don't know actually how to get past it. And as parents, we actually haven't taught them how. So we've got to sort this stuff out, and it's unfortunate reality that they don't have a lot of problem-solving skills. So we have to teach that. You have to teach that to your people when they come to work for you. Supporting the vulnerable. This is about looking at doing mental health training for your managers. And as I said, it's not just mental health first aid, right? This goes much further. This is about how we have mental health discussions, right? It's not hard. It's a lot about compassion and empathy. As I said, this is my slide about, sorry, it's not an admission of liability, just acknowledge the pain. Making sure that people feel like they're part of the team, that they're connected, even when they're off work for an extended period of time. If your workplace wellbeing, actually your wellbeing strategy outlines and says, if you're off work for any length of time, we're going to call you for the first 3 days, every day, just to check on you. Not because we want you to know when you're coming back to work. It's kind of like, how are you doing? We don't know whether or not we probably do if they live alone or whatever the situation is. But it's just that simple acknowledgement that actually we care about you. But what happens is most employers kind of go, oh no, but if they've got a medical certificate and they're not here, we can't say anything. We can't say anything at all. But we can. We can show some compassion. We can give them a call and kind of go, how you feeling? Oh, that's a bit rough. I'm sorry to hear that. All right, well, hopefully you'll feel better tomorrow. I'll talk to you then. It's a connection. And we actually need connection to survive. Connection is actually the most basic of our needs, because without connection, we actually can't survive. And that's why it's so important to our growth. And if I'm out of the workplace for any length of time and nobody bothers to call me or check in on me or do anything, do I feel like I'm connected to my workplace? No. Do I feel like my manager, excuse the French, gives a shit? No. Why would I? You only care if I'm actually turning up and doing something. You get mad at me if I don't do what it is that I understood you wanted me to do. The connection is really, really important. External early intervention. Most people in large organisations have got an external EAP, right? So the Employee Assistance Program where they can go and see somebody. There is a statistic I need you to understand, right, really clearly, and I hope you're all listening. The EAP solution is too late. Not only is it too late, but there aren't enough resources out there to actually provide these services anymore. There are less than 2,500 psychologists in private practice in Australia these days. Okay? Less than 2,500 for 25 million. When I started talking about what happened through the pandemic, the Prime Minister stood up there and just said, oh, you can go and see your psychologist twice as many times a year. Oh, great. Where are we going to find all of those people? Especially because they've increased the years that it takes to actually get in to be a psychologist anyway, the level of training that you require, and then don't even start me on the regulatory framework that we're supposed to operate under to deliver services. There is a whole lot of stuff that impacts how we do these things in our health services areas in this country. So it has to change. We have to stop creating the psychological injuries in the first place. And a big part of how we do that is starting in the work environment, but also supporting people who already tell you that they've got a bit of an issue. Where we talk about multi-stage frameworks. In large organisations, we talk about promotion, prevention and early intervention around mental health. It's the promotion of mental health as a thing. Guess what? Pandemic did it for us. We don't really have to talk about promotion much anymore because people are very aware of mental health. In fact, we've got so much more mental health literacy within the community and understanding, but it's filtering into the workplace, but we actually have to make a conscious effort to bring it in. The prevention is the biggest thing that we can do to make it so that we don't actually have an ongoing issue with mental health in our community. And that's actually where you come in as the leaders in these organisations and showing up each day and being proud of what your culture actually says about your leadership. Because did you know that currently in the world, 80% of workplaces are toxic? 80%. Interestingly, out of people who work in toxic cultures, 33% of people who work in a toxic culture will be the ones who will escalate it. You can't do that to me. I'm going to take it to the higher authority. I'm going to report you to this person or that person, and they'll escalate it and they'll fight. That's only 33%. Right? 27% of people, when they see the toxicity, go, oh, this is rubbish, I'm out of here, and they up and go and find a new job really quick. And 40% sit there and do nothing and just complain and tell their colleagues that they hate working here. But oh well, it's as bad everywhere you go, isn't it? They validate each other's experience as negative, and it's terrible. So the early intervention, which is where we get to the EAP program, you can see why it's too late. We have to change it. So recovery at work. Make sure that you actually allow your people to understand that you think that they're important enough to allow them to recover in the workplace. Somebody might be having a hard time, but you know what? You're much better off to let them come to work and at least make a contribution for half the time than you are to let them go off on a workplace injury claim and find that they're not there at all. Validation comes into what their experience is, and it makes that easier for them to manage. And then giving them a sense of purpose for their continued and ongoing input to your workplace. How do you value them? What's the meaning that they bring to your organisation and the purpose for them being there? So, just while we're here, I'd like you to just think about one thing that I've talked about this afternoon that might have been really helpful for you. And maybe you can send it through to me later on social media. You'll find me, most of the platforms. I'm not very good on social media, but you'll find me. And just give me one thing that you found really valuable this afternoon. Something that you hadn't really heard before or hadn't thought about before. And then I want you to think about one thing that you can apply in your organisation. if you take one thing from today and you think about what's the one thing that you could put in place tomorrow that might make it easier for your people, I want you to really make a commitment to making